Good afternoon. Thank you so much. It is a tremendous honor to be invited to speak again at the Future of Hellenism conference after 2 years. I would first like to thank all the people who have made this conference a possibility, to the AHI leadership for inviting me to speak, for all they have done to me, and to everyone who's part of the AHI family for bringing this cause to fruition. Thank you. The speech that I gave 2 years ago was a meditation on Hellenism and what I thought the term meant in a deeper sense. In short, I argued that Hellenism is not simply an assemblage of ethnocentric conceptions and cultural customs. Hellenism is not simply Greek bouzoukia, souvlaki, or the Greek language, though it in some sense includes those things. Rather, Hellenism, I believe in its purest sense, is the pursuit of human excellence, an ideal that is the central nexus of ancient Greek ethos and mythos. I will further elaborate this point in my talk, as I think it is important to explore in depth what we mean specifically and precisely when we use terms such as Hellenism or Greek culture. Today, we gather to discuss the future of Hellenism. I believe that we are at an inflection point, given that immigrant groups in the United States tend to become completely assimilated into the prevailing culture over a period of time. The fundamental question is how Hellenism will survive and thrive in the successive generations and not disappear entirely. Whereas my previous speech was more descriptive, this speech will be more prescriptive. In my speech, I will discuss how the embrace of a more profound and deep understanding of Hellenism beyond normative traditions will actually lead to the long-term preservation of those cultural customs, and that a more expansive Hellenism can be repurposed into practical organizational and structural initiatives. There are many ways that we can demarcate daily living, and there are many, and have been many, poetic and philosophical ways that we can frame it. But to put it practically, scientifically, life essentially consists of two elements: its content and its context. So content refers to external markers, such as profession, family life, friendships, hobbies, and various extracurricular activities, such as attending this event. Whereas context refers to subjective experience. Overall, people regardless of race, culture, or ethnic background are concerned about being successful in these two particular aspects. They want to do well in external markers, whether it be having a great career, family, friends, but they also want to enjoy the process as well, and they want to be happy individuals. And what does not address the content or the context of people's lives, including culture and normative traditions, is usually considered unimportant and overall declines over a period of time. On balance, I do think that the staying power of Greek American culture is a pressing issue and should be viewed through the structuralist lens of both content and context. In the conference 2 years ago, Mr. Elias mentioned that among younger generations of Greek Americans, around 70% of marriages were outside the Greek racial group, making the ability to preserve Greek language more difficult. Speaking from my own personal interactions, I was on the AHI foreign policy trip for young Greek Americans 2 summers ago, and one of my colleagues was Nico, a Greek American from Nebraska, which has a very strong Greek American community and has produced many famous Greek Americans like Pete Peterson, who's the founder of Blackstone. Nico is engrossed in the culture. He's completely fluent in Greek. However, many young Greek Americans his age have already been completely assimilated within traditional American culture, and Nico was concerned in our discussions that Greek culture will completely disappear from the Nebraska community within the next 20 years. Another Greek American colleague of mine told me that he actually decided to learn Chinese instead of Greek because he thought that Chinese would be more useful for his own professional purposes. Though some of these stories are anecdotal, they are telling. Notable linguists actually once referred to the United States as the graveyard of cultures because of its ability to assimilate. Many groups, especially Americans of Irish and German descent, are completely divorced from the traditions and the customs of the ancestors that came over 100 years ago. Even though Greeks are very proud and passionate about the culture, I do think looking at the sociological and historical trends of other European groups, unless there is a vast immigration from Greece to the United States over the next several decades, there is a very strong case to make that the Greek American community may have the same fate as the Irish and German communities through intermarriage and the undercurrent of assimilation. In terms of how Hellenism can be relevant to the practical aspect or content of people's lives, AHI actually provides a model that I think can be replicated and can help in staving off the fate of other immigrant groups. In speaking on this, I will provide my own personal experience and how I was actually led to AHI. My father was born and grew up in Greece, but spent most of his adult life in the United States. Almost all of his friends were non-Greeks. He almost never spoke Greek except with his relatives, and his mannerisms were much more of a London cosmopolitan than the Greeks he grew up with in Epirus. Growing up, I did not learn the Greek language, knew almost nothing of the Greek culture, and never visited Greece. My mother is Chinese, so in my early years I learned the Chinese language and was raised more in that culture. I knew technically that I was half Greek, but I didn't really feel it in any meaningful way or really regard myself as Greek. It was my uncle Nico who started visiting me on a regular basis when I was at the age of 10 that completely changed the dynamic. When I first met my uncle as a young boy, I did not know what to make of this Zorba-like character. Though my father is a very charming person, he's more of a quiet figure. And it, frankly surprised me that the two were related, given how different they were. My uncle called me, saying, "Yasu Elias," from across the room. I asked my father, what is Yasu? And he translated it as hello. Since I never heard anyone called Elias before, I then asked, and this shows the extent of my ignorance, what kind of name is Elias? Who is this Elias? Is there some relative that I'm not aware of? And my father clarified, no, you are Elias. Elias is the way that your name is pronounced in Greek. My uncle then proceeded to jokingly critique my father for not teaching me Greek, and then we proceeded to have a wonderful time. As the relationship with my uncle deepened, I really began to look at the Greek culture more seriously. I had great affection for my uncle and great admiration for him, and since he was so proud of being Greek and talked about it a lot, I started to become curious about the culture. I wanted to see what is this about. However, my relationship with the Greek culture was mostly cerebral, as I did not really know any Greeks beyond my father and my uncle, with the exception of a few relatives I infrequently met at occasional baptisms I attended. I read books on Greek history, modern and ancient, and salient works by notable Greek authors, but again, I did not have much personal experience with the Greek culture. That changed when I went to university. At the University of Pennsylvania, I met Panagiotis, a Master's of Law student, and he told me about the American Hellenic Institute and its foreign policy trip, where a delegation of 10 young students would have the opportunity to spend 2 weeks, 1 week in Cyprus and 1 week in Greece, to discuss important foreign policy issues. I applied to be part of the trip, and AHI accepted my application. The trip was life-changing. This was the first time I ever went to Greece. I very much bonded with people that I met with Greece and Cyprus, as well as the peer group, who very much embraced me despite my lack of Greek linguistic ability and cultural background. During the trip, I had a great opportunity to also meet the Deputy Ambassador to the EU, who was a Greek gentleman. Due to the relationship I developed with this gentleman, I was able to work for the Greek Permanent Mission to the United Nations as a summer advisor. And ultimately, I think that AHI's ability to immerse someone who didn't even know the Greek pronunciation of his own name really speaks to the efficacy of the AHI program and the institution overall. However, though I think Nick is very much ingenious in creating these opportunities and crafting this particular trip, one organization, one Nikolariakis is not enough. I think successful Greek Americans and existing institutions should create the necessary infrastructure for mentorship programs, as well as Greek American professional networks. Though there are certain entities that do exist, I think there needs to be a certain standardization, and these institutional efforts need to be brought up to scale. I think that such efforts will help keep young Greek Americans together and make them feel that Greek culture is sensitive to the needs of those in the modern economy and is relevant to their lives. Moreover, a second question is, how can Hellenism be relevant to the context of the lives of individuals? Ancient Greek civilization is renowned for its intellectual effervescence. In particular, its emphasis on education. Though we think of education today in almost entirely in terms of career, social status, and monetary gain, it meant something else in its more ideal and original sense. Educare comes from the Latin cogne and means to lead from. From the perspective of the ancient world, and in particularly Greece, education meant to lead from darkness to light. Epictetus, the Greek philosopher, remarked that only the educated are free. Plato, in fact, regarded those who knew the Greek language, ate Greek food, and had Greek blood, but whom were not properly educated and unaware of his particular theory of forms as being shackled in a cave and unable to move. Even though the ancient Greeks were very tribalistic in their own particular way, the pressing question, at least for the ancient Athenians, was not of Greek food, clothes, or language. Those aspects were considered very important, but not primary for being a Hellene. What the ancients considered primary for a Hellene was whether or not that person was using various means, such as education, as a process to go beyond one's limitations and live a life of greater freedom. A Hellene was someone who appreciated Greek culture, but at the same time extended beyond it. That person's life represented a fire, a flame. It was a constant movement from untruth to truth, from inertia to effervescence, and something that went beyond all nationalistic identities. And it is this light which still blesses our lives, in the innumerable gifts that Greece has given Western civilization and the United States in terms of science, government, and various other components of daily life. Why do they think on these particular terms? And again, I'm not as extreme as Plato and do not consider individuals who do not prioritize education as being chained in a cave, but I do consider the sentiment to make some sense. The thinking is that if one knows very little, then that person is mostly concerned in their own trivial, self-centered affairs and isn't really thinking much beyond that. One's life is small, narrow, and circumscribed. Education is essentially a means of expanding the horizons of human perception, such that someone whose life is solely focused on their own daily affairs and vain yearnings is given a panoramic perspective of life. Through education, they understand that they are a part of a rich story of humanity and realize life's tremendous immensity. For the first time, that individual can view and have a taste of life's deep waters and vast expanse. The topic of education in ancient Greeks then brings up the question of what do we mean by Hellenism and Greek culture. When we think of Hellenism, we often make it synonymous with Greek culture. We do not create a distinction between Greek culture and Hellenism. And I think it is very careful that we need to very carefully and thoughtfully look at our terminology. We often think of Hellenism as Greek cultural practices, whether it be traditional dancing, souvlakia, bazoukia, social gatherings, and often do not think of Hellenism beyond these specific demarcations. I will argue that there is a distinction. To create a clear and simple analogy, let's examine the concept of being an American. Being an American is often associated with certain cultural markers like apple pie and baseball. Though being an American may include these cultural aspects on a deeper level, the United States represents something beyond ethnocentric identity. It speaks to something more fundamental, something that goes back to primordial man, which is man's search for freedom. The United States is a society that is built on this yearning and provides the necessary structures and ethos to allow for the flourishing of freedom and the joy that comes out of it. The enduring power of the United States is that it has something, or it is imbued with something, that has a certain transcendent quality to it. and a certain universality that speaks to the human condition at large. I think the same is true of Hellenism. Though Greek culture is part of Hellenism, it is not the whole. Hellenism is the effort to constantly expand one's horizons, to move past one's smallness, and to develop deep comprehension and understanding and vision. This revolutionary quality of not having a life simply focused on pleasures and survival, of going beyond one's limitations and into the process of becoming more available to life's vastness, is the Hellenic spirit. Such an individual who endeavors in this regard is blessed, for in this person is joy and truth. You may ask, okay, Elias, this sounds very poetic, but how is this relevant to our current times? As I've argued, for Greek traditions to be preserved going forward, whether it be in the food, the clothing, the dancing, and all traditional demarcations, those cultural entities have to be connected to something of much greater and deeper purpose. This will be especially important over the next several decades, when Greek Americans will only have 50% Greek blood, or 25%, or 12.5% over successive generations. If Hellenism is tied to something much larger than its own ethnocentricity, if it is imbued with its natural transcending qualities, and viewed not only through the reductionist lens of culture, future generations of only partially Greek heritage, who will not be obliged by family to adopt Greek culture, will be able to view it as something worthwhile and will voluntarily invest in it. So how can this expansive view of Hellenism be implemented in a practical way? Well, I think we've already discussed that to some extent, and that is through educational institutions. Not only has the Odyssey School experienced tremendous success, but this has been done by charter schools throughout the nation. The Archimedean Upper Conservatory, which teaches Greek philosophy, language, and mathematics, is located in Miami-Dade. 75% of its students are Hispanic, and many are low income. It is now considered one of the top 100 schools in the United States. Due to the larger, more universal nature of the mission of these educational institutions, Greek cultural customs have been able to be preserved and passed down to Greeks and non-Greeks alike. We should seriously be thinking about creating many schools across the country based on the aforementioned institutions and work together to make that a reality. In summary, I think building institutions that embody a larger purpose and have Greek culture tied into that larger principle will allow for the sustenance of Greek culture over a period of time. I believe that building institutions such as the Archimedean Academy or the Odyssey School should be the primary focus as much as Greek dancing festivals, if not more so. Younger, multi-ethnic Greeks may not necessarily connect with Greek dancing or different aspects of Greek culture. Greeks are not a monolith. In fact, even Greeks born in Greece, like my father, do not necessarily feel a connection with or agree to all the aspects of Greek custom, tradition, or culture. But I do think that integrating Greek customs and higher ideals will imbue Hellenism with a certain universalism, while at the same time maintaining its uniqueness, in the process uniting people of all backgrounds under the Hellenic fold. Let us share this blessing in Hellenism with all people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least is Elizabeth, who joined us on the AHI Student Foreign Policy trip this year. So Elizabeth, welcome.
Hello, it is a pleasure to be here with all of you. First, thank you to Nick and